That takes a minute. How handy of it. We are live on Zoom and Facebook.
Woohoo! Hello, everyone.
All right, I think we're ready as soon as we hit noon.
All right.
For everyone who's just joining us, we'll get started. Hi. Thank y'all so much for being here. So I'm Britin Bostic. I'm the City of Georgetown's Downtown and Historic Planner. Joining me is most excellent Ann Evans with our award-winning Georgetown Public Library. This is Tuesday Talks with Britin and Ann, and we have what we think is a really fun presentation today. We talk a lot about historic preservation. We talk a lot about history. We don't talk a lot about what happens when you take apart a historic home. Usually we're trying to protect and preserve them, but sometimes things happen and they aren't able to come with us. And so we have what's a little bit unusual. We have a lot of documentation of a historic farmhouse that was salvaged a couple of years ago. And since we had so many photos, we wanted to be able to share what that looks like, what some of the construction techniques are, some of what you can and can't salvage, what that looks like. And then also we've got an interesting story behind it. There's a little bit of a mystery left. There usually is when we're researching historic properties, but this is one we're hoping somebody might be able to give us some clues on. And so if you have any comments, you can use the chat or the Q&A during our presentation. If you're watching live from Facebook, you can comment on the post for the live event and we'll try to get to your questions. And then you can also contact us later on. We'll share our contact information at the end of the program. So this is the house at 1111 East 7th Street. This is really close to the Oddfellow Cemetery at the end of East 7th Street. It's back behind Southwestern University. And the house that you're seeing in this photo is not there anymore. This is the house that was deconstructed a couple of years ago. This is the house that is much older than it looks. And it might even be older than we've been able to find out. So that's part of the mystery that we'll be sharing. Back in 1934, someone flew around the city of Georgetown in an airplane. and took photos. And this is from one of the photos that they took. So special thanks to Special Collections at Southwestern University. They're such a great partner for us, and they provided this photo. So what we've highlighted in the yellow is the house that you just saw, but it's from a distance and the photo is really blurry. So it's hard to see what's going on. It took me a little while to process what I was looking at, but what you see is a 2-story house with a front porch across the full front of the house. Now I'll go back to the picture of what we had in 2019, and that doesn't fit. We don't have that big full-length front porch across the front, 2 stories in height, but that's what we see in this photo. And so some of the story that we're telling today is about how much this house has changed over time. The city of Georgetown has aerial photographs from 1964. So basically someone flew much higher up and took a photo that's almost like a map. And the house is visible along with some farmland next to it. And you can see the cemetery just there to the right. That's to the east. This is before the Oddfellow Cemetery was expanded to the north. And so you're seeing what we would see on the ground in 1964. We're seeing what was kind of left of the railroad track, buildings and tanks there to the left, and then Southwestern University is to the south, just kind of to the bottom of the picture out of sight. So this was on the edge of town back in the 60s, and then definitely on the edge of town even earlier than that. We have some photos from 1984, thankfully, that give us a good idea of what this house looked like back in 1984. And so that year, what was then the Georgetown Heritage Society and what's now Preservation Georgetown had a lot of work done to record and document as many historic structures in the city as they could find. And these were structures that were 50 years old and older at the time, or at least assumed to be. And so this house made it. You can see very similar to what we saw in the first photo, but kind of a notable difference. You can see chimneys poking up through the roof in this photo that we don't see in the 2019 photos right before it was demoed. And so this house originally had chimneys on both ends. It was actually for gas stoves, not for big fireplaces. And so you see the chimney, but you don't see like a big fireplace on the outside. They weren't on the inside either. So that's kind of interesting that those chimneys were built for like a gas or a smaller scale heater and not like a big fireplace like you might expect. This is taken kind of from standing in the road over by the cemetery on the side. There were some outbuildings like a garage for a car up in the front and buildings to the back. And so this is kind of a farmhouse property that had evolved over time. And you had some really interesting information when you were doing research on where this house came from. And there's a man, everything links back to Southwestern in this story.
Yes.
And so there's a man though that was really early on associated with this property and kind of contributed to the mystery. So tell us about Mr. Rivas.
So first starting off is we know that W.I. Anderson, who is one of the first people to own this property, kind of sold it to Southwestern, and eventually around the late 1890s, it ends up in the hands of Mr. L.A. Rivas, who was a Methodist preacher in this area. And this is a clipping from the Sun that Mr. L.A. Rivas is building a cottage on a lot near the Oddfellow Cemetery. And this is really the only thing that we have that indicates something is being built on this land. And it doesn't quite, Britin, you'll talk a little bit, I think, about how these dates don't exactly line up, so with what we're thinking. And from what we can tell, L.A. Rivas isn't really in town. He and his wife Nanny aren't in town for very long. By 1901, we've got accounts of them being located in another part of Central Texas. It may have been that he was some sort of circuit preacher. It wasn't a dedicated preacher here in Georgetown. But we do have accounts of him being here. We have accounts of him being in this conference, the Methodist conference for this area, all around this time. But there's not really much to indicate that he's here for a prolonged period of time, that he stays in Georgetown for a while. But he did definitely start building a cottage next to the Oddfellow Cemetery, and that's some of the first accounts we have of this.
So when we say cottage, I don't associate the word cottage with the house that we were looking at.
I don't either.
So we think that if he built a house, it maybe wasn't this particular house. And there's kind of a good reason why, but we'll continue to kind of go through the key players. This one's kind of, I love a good house mystery. Sometimes we've been able to show moved house mysteries where houses got relocated around Georgetown and we had to kind of hunt them down and track them down and figure out where did they come from and who had them and why did they get moved. And that's great fun. This mystery is a little bit different. We're not actually sure how old this house is. So we have that account that Ann showed from 1899 saying that Mr. Rivas built a cottage. The style of the house that we're talking about today is not something that I think anybody, especially at that time, would consider a cottage. It was not a small structure. It's what's called an I house. And you might think an I house would come from the letter I, but it has a different history. The point that I want to make here before we get to how the house was laid out is the amount of money that was spent to acquire this property in 1913. So we see this newspaper article that says C.C. Hamilton and wife to Olive Ball Giddens, meaning they sold to Olive Ball Giddens a tract out of the William Addison survey in Georgetown. They paid $1,135 cash and $2,365 in notes. So they spent over $3,000 for the property that they had bought, which was a decent sized property, but it indicates a pretty substantial, nice house was there in 1913, where we don't really see a record of it beforehand. This is not a house that I would associate with Charles Belford's Lumber Company or Charles Belford's style of building. This is a house that really has, we see in Georgetown as early as 1868. It's a house that I would assume to have been built between the 1860s and 1880s, but it looks like it may have been newly built around 1912. And then C.C. Hamilton, it turns out, the man who I believe built the house and then very quickly sold it to the Giddens family, was not part of the Belford Lumber Company, but a little bit. And tell us a little bit more about him and who he was in Georgetown.
So C.C. Hamilton is actually the person that bought it from the Rivases, the property. And he actually was a very prominent person in Georgetown's history. He worked as an alderman for most of his life, actually, here in Georgetown. And he did work for the Belford Lumber Company. He actually clerked for Belford with one of the members of the Booty. If you're familiar with Booty's Crossing, Booty's Road, that's where that comes from, as there was a lot of those families around here. He worked for Belford Lumber Company, and then he actually went on to work for Level Hamilton and Nelson, and then Linville Peterson and Hamilton, which were both different hardware stores and lumber stores, hardware predominantly, on the Georgetown Square. So he was working in this kind of industry where it wouldn't be out of the realm of ordinary for him to possibly be building a house. He would have all of those easy connections.
So that's kind of interesting because we have someone that was connected in the building industry and may have had that skill set himself, and yet it's an older house.
And
so
we don't know. I do like, though, that it described him in The Sun in 1909 as a hustler. So, so I think that just adds to an element to this story that maybe there was something there and he made improvements and he sold it for a profit. Who knows?
That's amazing. Well, we also know that he had pretty good cursive handwriting, because on the left is the deed where he sold the property to the Giddens family. And so it lays out, here's what he had sold, he and his wife Helen. Here's what they sold and here's for how much. And we see that high figure again. They're paying like over $3,300 for this property. And it wasn't just for the house. So sometimes when we think about buying property in Old Town today, we think it's like just the house with maybe a lot around it. The lots could be really big or they could be smaller. But this is something that seemed to have come with a bit of a farm to it. And so the top part kind of lays out, it's really hard to read the cursive, I know, especially on the slide, but the top part essentially lays out, my wife and I are going to sell this property to the Giddenses for about $3,300. And it has all the legal whereases and wherefores and all that fancy stuff. The bottom part where the the writing gets really kind of cramped and they run out of room, essentially, is describing the property. And it was kind of a collection of pieces of land from all these different property owners, including Southwestern University. So they're kind of saying, this is part of what Southwestern used to own back when they owned this property, but it's combined with some other parts of property. And so it was a few acres that they had bought. This is farmable land. And what's so funny is it's kind of described as being on the edge of Georgetown and kind of out on the edge of the prairie. So this is a point in time in which we don't have a lot of nearby structures. We do know that the cemetery was there by that point. We know that a number of people were already interred in the cemetery. So it wasn't just a couple of people. The Oddfellow Cemetery was really going concern. But the only other document that we've been able to find that shares when construction occurred to the house, beyond we think it was C.C. Hamilton around 1912, is that the Giddens had a daughter, and she ultimately became the owner of the house with her husband. And she and her husband had the J.A. Collins Lumber Company, which I think was out of Waco, do improvements to the house in the 1960s. So around 1966, there was a lot of changes done to the house. And so those are kind of the two key documents that we have that share what the timeline might be. And then we have some other information sharing a little bit about the family. The Giddens family owned the house for the majority of its life. And so all things lead back to Southwestern on this particular program, because the owners, Lee and Ollie Giddens, their son ended up, he was a Southwestern student, played sports for Southwestern, and then he ended up going on to be a school superintendent south of here in Columbus. And so he, in his obituary, it's really kind of mentioned that he had done a lot of great work in terms of athletics programs. And then we can see that there was also kind of a newspaper article talking about how he had contributed to athletics programs and done really well. But there are kind of two sides to that. So the Portal to Texas History also has a letter that was sent from the state director of the League of United Latin American Citizens. So there was a point in time in which Marley Giddens was a school superintendent, not here in Georgetown, but in another part of Texas. And there was some kind of disciplinary action that had occurred that was really upsetting to a lot of parents of Mexican-American students. And so they had kind of gotten with the League of United Latin American Citizens to write this letter, essentially protesting the action and kind of calling for him to meet with them and to resolve this issue. And so kind of interesting to see these documents, especially from the Portal to Texas History. I use that a lot for photos, but they also have a ton of letters and articles and other things that have been contributed to the collection over time. So if you're doing research on a property, be sure to check out the Portal to Texas History. It's run through the University of North Texas, and it's a great collection of Texas items, both photographs and other documents that are helpful. So as we get back to the house, this is a house that in this photo and kind of at the end of its life doesn't really convey how this house started out. So I talked a little bit about this being an I house. An I house was named the I house not because of the shape, but because it was so predominant in states in the United States that started with the letter I. This was a Midwest housing type. So think Iowa, Indiana, Illinois, that's where you would see a lot of these houses, and that's where there's still a lot of these houses. It was generally a two-story house, very rectangular, kind of boxy looking. And this is kind of a very simplified version of it. But originally this house had a full width double front porch. So you see a front door there on the bottom. There's a door right above it too. And both of those doors would have led out onto the original front porch, which is quite fantastic. Remember, this is back before air conditioning. I'm pretty sure that when this house was built, there was no electricity to it. I don't think it had electricity for quite some time. And so they had to, in the summertime, be able to take advantage of breezes as much as possible and sitting outside either to do work or housework or just to be able to get a little bit of a break from the heat that would have built up in the house over time. So from what I can tell, a lot of things on this house were replaced or repaired in the 1960s. So we talked about the lumber company out of Waco doing that work. It looks like the windows were replaced. So we went from wood windows to these were now aluminum windows, not as high of a quality, something pretty typical of the 1960s. You see asphalt siding on the exterior. You might be familiar with asbestos siding. Asphalt siding is a different product. It's a lot more flexible. It's easier to install. Also something that was really typical in the 1960s, but they covered right up all of the original wood siding. And then the porch, I think, was removed around the 1960s, and then the smaller porch was built back. And one of the reasons that I know that for sure is this newer porch used galvanized nails, and we didn't have galvanized nails in 1912. So that was a pretty good clue also of when things might have happened. We've got floor plans of what was there. So a really simple house on the first floor. Basically, you walk into a hallway and there's a big room on the right, a big room on the left. This house had a rear, what looks like an addition, but I think it was actually original to the house based on how it was built and based on similar foundation elements. And then it had a back porch and kind of an L shape that would have been another useful place for everything from shelling peas and working on tools to other things and just sitting again to get out of the house that would have warmed up. It had a really beautiful staircase that went up to the second floor. And then the second floor was, I think originally one big bedroom on either side of that central hallway, but ultimately the bedroom on the right was split into two, probably to make room for additional family members. And then there was a big attic space over that back part where the living or kind of dining area and kitchen was. And that attic was never finished out. We've actually got a picture of it. By the time we got to 2019, the house is
really
in kind of
Britain. I was going to say, I really like in that photograph, you can, or in that layout, you can really see all of the windows that are directly across from each other, which would have made for the nice cross breezes.
Oh, that's a good point.
And yeah, especially during the summer and especially in the bedrooms, it's very evident.
It was really symmetrical. The main part of the house was almost just completely symmetrical, which is something that we don't see a whole lot of. It's one of the reasons that this house is so funny to me, and I'm glad you pointed that out, Ann. Houses built in the 1912 period were oftentimes not as symmetrical. Houses built just before that really often not symmetrical. Victorian, especially the Queen Anne houses that we would have seen in the late 1890s and early 19 teens here in Georgetown would have been asymmetrical a lot of times. This was a very symmetrical house. Something that the earliest house that I'm aware of in Georgetown is from 1868. It was built out of limestone. It's our first local historic landmark out on Westinghouse Road. We designated that this year. And so same basic shape and same basic principles as this house, but it was built out of limestone and this was built out of wood. But that symmetry is something that you would have seen earlier on. And then you would have seen additions as either the family grew or they needed kind of new elements, or they maybe became more affluent and wanted more living space. That's also an option. So based on what we've seen in this house, this was a nice house. It maybe doesn't look so nice in these photos, but when it was built and through a lot of its life, I think it was nice. And so here we begin to see kind of the outside peeled away and the beautiful wood underneath. You can't buy wood like this today at the hardware store.
Especially not right now.
Unfortunately, this is all pine. You might have heard of longleaf pine. So longleaf is really kind of to describe a variety of pine that was pretty predominantly used. The trees were really big. They were very dense and they produced a really beautiful wood. You see it being a really reddish tone in these photos, but also kind of a grayish color, and that has to do with weathering. So the boards that are on the inside of the house are less weathered than the boards on the outside, even though they were under siding. But what's important about this is you're looking at the entire wall. So you see basically one layer of boards, and then you see a second layer of boards behind it. That was the whole wall. There was no insulation. There were no studs. There was none of that. This is balloon framed, which is also an older method of construction that I'm surprised to see in 1912. And then you can see this little horizontal line. I'm not sure how well it shows up in the presentation, but you can see the floorboards tongue and groove fitted together is one of those lines, one of those kind of horizontal lines in between the wall. So basically they built the outside walls and then they put the floor in, And then they built the interior walls on top of the floor. Very different from how we would build today. This is a picture just under that front porch where the transom is over the front door, just showing some of the details. Some of it's covered up by the asphalt siding and by some changes over time, but there was some really nice wood trim to all of the doors and windows originally. Kind of what helps me think that this was a really nice house. The following photos are not going to support me saying that this is a really nice house. This is where things start to kind of literally fall apart. The house hadn't been taken care of for a very long time. This house never had central heat and air conditioning, even up to 2019. Though there were a few window units, I think, but not central heat and air. And so a lot of the moisture kind of got to this house over time, and then you see a lot of decay. There have been some vandalism in this house by that time too. Oftentimes vandalism can be really cosmetic. In this case, it was mostly cosmetic, but a few things have been kind of torn off and punched, but it's a beautiful staircase that you see. And to my knowledge, that's the original staircase with the railing up to the second floor. And so as we get up to the second floor, some pretty wild orange shag carpeting that may have been from the 1966 remodel.
I would say that's the 60s showing there a little bit.
Oh, that's funny. But still, so you see this really old stair railing, and then you see this carpet. There was some linoleum flooring that was put in over time, and then all of the ceilings had been dropped down from the original ceiling height, maybe to help keep the rooms warmer. And then also you can see all of the windows got replaced with aluminum windows, which it's really odd to see the windows protruding into the room the way that you see them in the picture on the right. But you have to remember the walls were barely 3 inches thick. So normally these windows would be put into a thicker wall, a wall that was built out with studs and sheetrock and maybe brick on the outside of the house. And in this case, the walls were just really, really thin and didn't allow for that. As some of the deconstruction happened, you can start to see some really beautiful paint color, what may have been original colors in the house. So we see this really vibrant kind of green, and then you can see some of the nails coming out, really simple but very well constructed house. And in the photo on the right, that's the attic that was over the dining room and the kitchen. What was really odd was by the time this house was deconstructed in 2019, the chimneys had been knocked off the top of the house. So the house had gotten re-roofed. They knocked the chimneys off to roof over those openings. And then where the chimneys would have gone down into the rooms to connect to like a gas stove or a smaller stove, that had been knocked off. The only sections of the brick chimneys remaining at that point were in the attic spaces. It's like they just chopped off the top and bottom and let them hang, which is pretty precarious. That's a lot of weight, even for a fairly small brick chimney. It's still several hundred pounds, and they just kind of left it suspended up in the attic space, which was kind of wild.
Do we know if that was done after the 1984, because they were still in the photograph? Right?
Oh, so I think that would have been after they re-roofed so sometime after 1984, I think the house got re-roofed and they just kind of pulled some pieces out because the chimneys were still there in 84, but not there by 2019. I think I've got some exterior photos that kind of show back to that in a minute. So as we try to unpack and figure out when things were happening, sometimes, again, it's a bit of a mystery.
We're not even sure when it was built originally.
Right. And I wish we'd had original photos of this house. So if you're aware of any photos of a 2-story house that has a full front porch across the front and we can't identify it with something else in Old Town, please let us know. We'd be glad to see if we can find out what this house looked like. We do have a few original pieces though. And so the photo on the left is a part of the front door, which I believe was original. The locks got changed out over time, but the wood with the glass panels, this was a really nice front door. Obviously it had a lot of deterioration, but this was something that was really well built and a lot of care was taken. Something on the right that's kind of interesting. So this is the front room, kind of the front right room, what I assume to be kind of a living room or maybe a more formal like parlor. At one point, you see that the window goes all the way to the floor. And that's really weird. We don't see that a whole lot, especially because this room was carpeted by that point. Having carpet go right up to your windowsill is kind of strange. It turns out, and that really confused me for a while, but it turns out once I realized that this house had a 2-story full front porch, those windows originally would have opened out or opened up really high, and you could have walked right onto the front porch from any of the rooms inside. And that's a feature that is specific to houses built before air conditioning and when you really needed to take advantage of breezes. So rather than having to go out through the front door like we all have to do now, you just kind of walked in and out of those rooms on a summer evening. A lot of times the houses had shutters on either side of those windows. This is a feature that I would expect to see in earlier built houses, 1880s era, for example. Maybe a little bit later on, but it looks like even if the house was built in 1912, they're bringing some much earlier design and construction references to the house, because we don't see this nearly as much, especially in Georgetown by 1912. We don't see this a whole lot at all. I've seen other historic homes in Williamson County that have those windows with the sills to the floor. You see it a lot in the American South. You see it a lot in houses around. If you've been to New Orleans, for example, you'll see this a lot. There was also remnants of some of the old or even original wallpaper. So because these walls were so thin, remember, just 2 layers of boards for the outside walls and then the siding. And on the inside walls, it was just 1 layer of boards that was put up to divide the rooms. So wallpaper would have been a way to keep wind from passing through quite as much and would have created a little bit more of a comfortable environment certain times of the year. The wind would have...
Wallpaper would have been, but the wallpaper would have been really thick too at that point in time. It wouldn't be like what we have now.
Yeah, good wallpaper. Wallpaper historically is much more interesting. Yeah. At least we think so. And then this is the outside of the house. So this is the point that deconstruction really gets going. The asphalt siding had trapped a lot of water on the historic wood siding and caused it to become really brittle. And so rather than being able to salvage most of it, a lot of it was so brittle that if you tried to put a nail or screw through it, it just cracked and broke. So that's one of the challenges of putting siding on top of siding, especially if you put an asphalt or an asbestos siding on top of historic wood siding, maybe an aluminum siding. Sometimes it works out really well to remove that and just paint and maintain the wood siding, but sometimes it causes a lot of moisture to collect, and that deteriorates the wood and causes damage, and it could cause a lot of brittleness. So that's what happened here. So as the siding began to be removed, and there was a different kind of siding on the back half than there was on the front half, which suggests maybe this was not an original part, this 1-story portion that was added that ended up being the dining room and the kitchen. You can see these wood boards that were put up, and that's really all you get is these vertical wood boards. That's the wall, that's the whole wall there. And then you can see some of the openings that were created. So what we were able to see is the openings changed over time. So you can see kind of this lighter area where a bigger window was closed up to create a smaller window. That was to accommodate kitchen cabinets that were put in later. So there's lots of interesting places where things were added on later, less successfully. So this is part of an addition where it was really deteriorated. There was a lot of water damage. You can see kind of behind those vertical boards, there's a lot of damage to the wood beam. It's falling apart not only because of water, but also by termites at this point. But the house was sitting on limestone, kind of these limestone sections that had been hand hewn or hand carved. You can see the tool marks. So it was really stable, but a lot of the wood elements had deteriorated. So here's the back of the house, and you can see where windows and doors were boarded up and enclosed over time, which was kind of interesting to see as you began to pull these layers off. Also, it looks like the house was originally whitewashed. So before it got the asphalt siding on it, we had just a very simple whitewashed construction on the back. And you see that kind of around. This is an area where a 1-story bathroom addition was built on. This house didn't originally have a bathroom. It looked like it didn't have a bathroom maybe until the 1960s. And so probably had an outhouse on the property until then. And if you think there's no way that happened in Georgetown in the 1960s, nobody had an outhouse. Yep, they did.
Yeah, they did.
They really did. So just going through some more photos that you can see, some of the pieces that were taken off, beginning to take the roof off. Anytime you have wood in a really good condition, and the wood that you're seeing in this photo was in really good condition, you can salvage that and you can save it and repurpose it for later. So it's really important to know what the project can be used for. If you're going to use that in construction as structural pieces, if you're going to use that, kind of sand them and finish them and use that as just kind of an attractive element in new construction or in a remodel. Having a purpose is important, but sometimes if you don't have a purpose and just want to store it securely for a while, that's good too. When we started peeling up carpet, and there were 2 to 3 layers of carpet in most of the rooms. So rather than taking out the first layer of carpet, they just carpeted over it. So when you walked on it, the floor squished under your feet in a really weird way. Under that carpet, it turned out was an unusual find, this linoleum rug, which while probably was there for maybe the 1920s or 1930s. And do you know when linoleum rugs were popular?
It's around that time. It's really, and especially that style. I would assume it's probably the late 19 teens, 1920s.
This one was kind of cool. It was in what apparently turned out to be the dining room between the main house and kind of the 2-story portion and the kitchen on the back. And so you can kind of see the wear patterns where people would have sat at the dining table and their feet would have kind of worn down the pattern of the rug. They had just carpeted right over the top of it. And so when the salvage crew went to go try to lift this rug or kind of check the edges of it, this is something that had deteriorated over time. There wasn't a lot of protection. It held a lot of moisture in the carpeting because the house was not conditioned and there was no insulation or kind of barrier between the ground underneath or kind of the crawl space under the house and the floors. That's just a single layer of wood board floors. That's all there was for the floor. And so this linoleum rug had deteriorated a lot. They end up being really, really brittle. And so in trying to remove it, it basically crumbled to pieces and kind of turned to dust in a lot of instances. But it turned out they had also kind of glued the floor down. So you could see in this photo on the right, the wood floor, you can see the original unstained, unfinished floor. There's the lighter color. Where they glued it down on the floor was kind of that medium color. And then at some point after that, they had just finished and stained the wood floors around it and not bothered to do the whole floor. And so there was just kind of this collection of layers of time and changes that people had made. Also, when the fake wood paneling was removed from that room, it was discovered that there was this really beautiful blue paint on the walls. And so that was really a fun find. And then the ceilings were a lighter color. They look white in this, but the ceilings were really just a lighter color blue. But there was one single board wall between the dining room and the kitchen. And the kitchen either had a wood burning stove or a coal burning stove, some kind of stove that produced a ton of smoke. That's the same blue paint color, but the smoke from the fires in the kitchen before they got electric stoves had made a big color change, and all that residue had been on the boards from the kitchen. So pulling off the layers and seeing that was kind of interesting. And then those ended up being all salvaged and kind of stacked up to be removed, to be used elsewhere. So all that paint can be stripped off, all of that smoke can be stripped off, and the boards can be refinished. And those are pretty wide boards. So that's something that it's really very difficult to get your hands on today. So there's a lot of value in a lot of the lumber here, but you can kind of see again this brighter blue. And then toward the left, you see this dingy kind of gray color. And that's where the kitchen had kind of smoked out the paint color. This was, I think I mentioned this was a house that was constructed on top of limestone piers. And so if you think about a pier and beam foundation, it's a bunch of blocks set on the earth, and sometimes they're brick, sometimes they're stone, sometimes we found in Georgetown, sometimes they're tree stumps. They can be all kinds of things. They should be pretty firm. Limestone is a great material if you can set it really well. These were really well set. But then the beams, the part that spans between those limestone pieces, have to hold up a lot of weight, and they have to hold it for a long time. You don't want them to get wet, and you don't want termites to get into them. And unfortunately, both of those things happened here. You can also see a whole lot of debris where the exterior wall was peeled off. We found bits of pecans, bits of fluff, bits of all kinds of stuff. It looked like the squirrels had been hiding pecan shells kind of in every little crevice and cranny of the house that they could for their winter supplies. And so if they could find some warm fluff, they would hide it. and stash it away. And if they could find some pecan shells, they were doing that too. And then when the floorboards began to come up, by that point, there was a lot of material that could be salvaged, but a lot of material that couldn't. And so then, you kind of have to piece through and see what can be reused, but what's too deteriorated and might be kind of structurally compromised. And so one of the things that's confusing to us, you can see the floor was coming up for that back part here, but there were nails that held the floorboards down. Those were all square-headed nails. That's an older style of nail that we would not necessarily expect to see in 1912. You might have seen like a more refined, more finished nail by that point. And so some of the construction too seems a little bit older than 1912. And that's been kind of interesting. So here's some photos of the square-headed nails. That's a much earlier nail than I expected to see with this house. But there were also some fun finds, like an old Sprite cap and then what may have been a medicine bottle. And then Ann, you pointed out there's kind of an interesting connection maybe between this bottle and one of the prior property owners.
Yes, so the first property owner that we have is W.I. Anderson, and he was actually one of the first doctors in the county. So he actually worked as a druggist after he kind of retired from being a doctor, and we have him documented as a druggist into the 1870s, 1880s, which is interesting because again, he owns this property and it's kind of fitting with the style and the time and the square nails. And so it's just all intriguing and adds to the mystery of it all. One other strange thing is he actually was given a gold ring for service rendered to the Houston family from Sam Houston. I don't know what the service was, but the Briscoe Center in Austin has that gold ring that was given to Anderson. So who knows? Maybe Sam Houston stopped by this house at some point in time too.
I mean, that's kind of wild. We have lots of Sam Houston stories in Georgetown, and so. But that's the first time I've heard somebody got a gold ring for service rendered to the family. All these connections are so interesting. And all this came out of just this little bottle found in the dirt under the house. So as there were a lot of layers of linoleum and other kinds of flooring that were set on top of the floors, but for the most part, the wood floors were pretty intact. And so if you've ever wondered why it's expensive to get reclaimed wood floors, well, they all have to be salvaged by hand, one single piece at a time, using a wedge and or a crowbar and or a mallet. You don't want to damage the tongues or the grooves. And then you also have to do a lot of taking out of very old rusty nails. It's a very labor intensive process. So was salvaging the rest. So there was a lot of, like the ceilings had been lowered below the original ceiling heights. There was a lot of work that had been done that changed the interior, and a lot of that was not good or salvageable material. So all of that had to be stripped out and removed before they could get to the lumber. The windows were not something that was very worth salvaging. There was no energy efficiency in the window, not a whole lot of value. Some of the glass had already been broken out, but not a really high quality window product. And so those weren't saved. But if you have original wood windows in decent condition or even needing a lot of repair, those could still be salvaged and repaired or reused. So kind of important to understand what's possible and what's not. By the time the back of the house was taken off, you could kind of see a story in paint colors. And so you see that dining room on the right in the blue, and then there was the central portion that had been kind of a hallway, but before that was the wall of the back porch. Some vandalism had occurred, and so there was a lot of graffitied statement about the earth being flat. So it was important to them to convey that message. So I'll continue to convey that message in this presentation. It's very important to someone that the earth is flat. And so there you go. But then on the right, we see a really dingy kind of brown and then a yellow. So at some point in time, either rooms or even the exterior of the house was painted different colors, which is kind of fun. And then everywhere you see that reddish brown is where it was covered with siding and was never painted. So these are really long boards. These boards are at least 18 feet in length. So if anyone is listening who's familiar with construction or knows what hardware store prices are right now, an 18-foot long, 12-inch wide pine board is a very valuable piece. And so that's one of the reasons it was so important to salvage the lumber out of this house, is you can't buy this stuff anymore. This also pretty clearly shows that the chimneys were gone by this point. We should have seen 2 brick chimneys poking out of either side of the roof. And those apparently, I suspect they got pushed off onto the ground and those bricks disappeared, but somehow they left. We also found a trap door in the kitchen floor. And that made me a little nervous at first, Anne, because I thought trap door, like what nefarious purposes could be going on with this trap door? But you said it was maybe more like a root cellar.
It was probably much more common. It wasn't uncommon to have like a mini root cellar, especially in pre-refrigeration days. Something where you could put, especially your tubers, your corn, that type of thing, just to keep it dry and cool, but also to keep it in the house. So if you do have a dedicated cellar, you're not like running back and forth. You can bring in some stuff and have it there just for easy access while you're cooking. So no, not, unfortunately, not nefarious, nothing more interesting, probably pretty common.
Really cool though. That was kind of an exciting find, was to pull up all the flooring on top and then to see this wood floor and then all of a sudden realize, oh, this part removes and it's a trap door. So that was pretty fun. The first time I've seen one of those. So then you can see in the picture on the left, those were all of the floorboards that were taken up for that back part of the house. That was a lot of wood flooring, a lot of really good quality, very intact wood flooring. And so if you know of a property that's being salvaged and you're looking for a new wood floor, do some measurements and see if that'll fit. But this is one of the great things to recycle in a building potentially, is wood flooring. This had very little, if any, damage. And so, Anne, you were talking about keeping vegetables and kind of stuff that would like a cool, dry climate under the floorboards. So as much as we see a lot of water damage on the exterior of the house, the floorboards were amazingly very intact and in very good condition. And it looks like the environment under the center of the house had really dry soil, and it looks like that had been cool and dry for a long period of the house's life. And that helped with a lot of things. Didn't help to have the carpet layered on top of stuff, and that was able to absorb moisture, but under the house seemed to have worked like it was supposed to. It's easy to forget today that these houses were designed for no electricity and no air conditioning, and they actually sometimes function better without it. And so then by contrast, on the exterior, we saw a lot of wood decay and deterioration, things where kind of pieces might kind of flake off with the wood. And then these are some of the construction details. So very simply, but very effectively constructed. Basically, wood being nailed to wood, everything resting on those important limestone piers to support the weight of the house. And then the boards went straight up for these very tall walls. And then the floor was kind of constructed in the middle of it. What we did see was that over time, and I think this happened in the 1960s era remodel, it looks like some of the structural members, the wood beams in the floor, started to fail as early as the 1960s, because we start seeing concrete filled tubes supporting some of the wood beams. And so this is a pretty large area to span between the supporting limestone piers. And so that was one of the things that it looked like they had tried to address. And then ultimately, the house is just these kind of 4 standing walls with a bunch of stuff in the middle of it. And the 4 standing walls were one of the last things to come down. So you can see the front of the house looking like it's not supported anymore. It was really well built, and so it could stand up to the demo process. But as things were, as boards were being salvaged and taken down one by one, there were some really beautiful paint colors that appeared, and also some really interesting hints of wallpaper. So kind of going back to us thinking this was maybe kind of a fancy house, at least for where it was located and when it was built, it would have been really nice. And so as we got further down, we had been alerted to there being some pretty substantial termite damage in the structure of the house. And that bore out to be correct through this process. So a lot of the boards that you're seeing on the ground, it looks like, I thought you said that they were salvaging this. That doesn't look like salvage. Well, remember, there was a lot of non-historic material also that was not very good for salvage. All of that asphalt siding could not be salvaged. It's not something that you want to keep. And there was a lot of material that had a lot of damage to it. And so here's starting to show that. The picture on the right is what was the closest to a wood stud that was in the house. And you can see at this point, it's more like corrugated cardboard. The termites had torn through it so badly. So if you're looking at structural members, that have that much damage, because termites have just plowed all through it and chewed it all up. It really does look like corrugated cardboard, like if you pulled the kind of outside skin of the cardboard off. And then that wasn't in just the kind of the wall members, it was also pretty prevalent in the foundation. So what I'm showing in the picture on the right, it looks kind of funny. It's a little bit hard to tell in the photo, but that was a lot of termite damage to the floor beams. And so at some point in time, things had gotten wet enough or happy enough for the termites to really want to get into it. And they ended up getting into the structural members. So what's important to understand about this house is if you need to repair and replace some of those key structural elements, you can't do it without taking the house apart, because you have to take the house apart to get to those pieces. It doesn't work quite the way that a foundation does today. You would basically have to be kind of ripping those out from under the studs, if you will. But that had a lot of challenges to it too, especially because the house was sitting on top of these limestone piers. And so there were just a lot of difficulties that would have had to been addressed. You know, there are usually options to preserve, but they might be really cost prohibitive, just, you know, to be very honest about that. And so sometimes people have that opportunity and take that opportunity to replace and repair what they need to, but sometimes that's not an available option. And that was something that wasn't going to be a successful option here. It was much more successful in kind of the overall scheme, and was decided on, rather than to try to do those repairs and put that investment in, it was going to be more successful probably to document and archive a document of this property, and then to salvage as much material as possible. And there was a lot of great material to be done, but here's another picture, kind of this outside corner of the house where the wood had begun to deteriorate. And a lot of the house is sitting on this corner in terms of bearing weight. And so it was really important to be able to evaluate, could this be repaired and replaced, or was it going to have to be removed? And it ended up needing to be removed. And then you kind of have to take the house apart to get there. So just some detailed shots. Again, these really great square-headed nails. It was really fascinating. Once the big floor came up on the main house, they had just like one concrete pier in the middle to hold up this really long span of wood beam. And the beams were huge. They're about 6 inches by 9 inches, something that, again, it's not something you can really find today if you go down to the local lumber yard. But they had been really deteriorated. And it looks like in that remodel in the 1960s, that was such a big remodel, they'd taken out a loan for it. They had put these concrete filled tubes, kind of like a straw that you fill with concrete. They had put those up under the foundation of the house to try to offer additional support, because they had identified their problem at the time, but it ended up not being a successful long-term solution and didn't prevent the decay from happening. Also, you can see some big holes in the ground. That's not from where the tubes came out of. That's from where animals had buried under the house and had a really nice home. So they were probably really disturbed by what was going on, and probably felt a need to relocate. And then you can see these stone walls. A few pieces of those stone walls are load bearing and would have held the house up, but most of that stone was stacked in there just to give that stone skirting appearance around the foundation, to kind of hide the foundation and keep too much from getting in there. Didn't keep the animals out, but it did kind of provide a nice look when the house was built. And so as much lumber as possible, there were several, this is just one of many, many trailer loads that went to be privately stored and then to be used in the future. So you can see some of those really big wood elements, some of the flooring, some really great lumber to be reused in the future. And so here we are back in the 2019 view of the house. I really wish that we had a better picture at the time of what the house looked like when it was built, because through research and through documentation, we've kind of found that it was more spectacular than it appears today. And so ended up kind of looking much more humble, but we know was something people were really proud of. And if that was C.C. Hamilton, he did a great job. If that was somebody that he had hired, they did a great job too. But it's so important to us that we're able to share this information and what this looks like. If you do own a historic home and you're wondering what are the things to keep an eye on, what are things to look out for, moisture is always going to be something you want to look out for and try to prevent moisture from building up. And then you want to check on your foundation and make sure you aren't seeing termites or termite damage or something like that. There are a lot of solutions available, but those are things that you want to look out for early on so that you don't end up in a situation like this where the termites have made a really great home in the house for a long time and then not left very good return for their rent. So if you have questions or follow-up, we have a few minutes, so we're happy to take questions now. You can ask in the chat or the Q&A. If you're on Facebook, please feel free to comment on our live stream. We are going to be taking a break in August, so we'll be taking a little bit of a Tuesday Talk summer vacation. There will be no program in August. We do have all of our videos up online, and I'll be sure to highlight the links there. So if you miss us next month, feel free to catch up on some of the videos. We've done some really great programs this year. We did a lot of fun things for Tuesday Talks in May for Preservation Month when we did them every single week. But we're going to take August off, and then we'll be back in September for National Hispanic Heritage Month. And that's really exciting. We have a wonderful neighborhood in Georgetown specifically that's known for its Mexican-American heritage and the families that have been a critical part of that neighborhood in Georgetown's history for a very long time, since at least the 1930s, and we think the 1920s now. So that's been really fun to research and learn more about, and we're looking forward to sharing it with y'all. And do you have any last hints? Oh, I just realized as I said that, the daughter of the people who bought the house, so the daughter of the Giddens who ended up living here a little bit later in her life, I say that this may have been a fancy house. Her wedding guest list had over 900 people, which is I'm not saying that they all came to her wedding. I'm just saying her invite list was over 900 people. And so that was one of the biggest wedding invitation lists I think I've ever heard of, regardless. So that was kind of an amazing.
Rivals a queen, I would think.
I mean, really, I don't know if I hope they all showed up or not. I hope they all gave her presents. I'll put it that way. That would have been pretty great.
Yeah. I just wanted to say, if you guys want to read at all about this house, if you want to go in depth, the Texas History Room is reopened, and we do have Britin's report on this house in there. So you are welcome to come back during our open hours, 9 to 6, Monday through Friday, 9 to 5 Saturdays, and noon to 5 on Sundays. The Texas History Room does close about 10 minutes before the rest of the building, but you can come in there. You can read about this historic home. You can read about other historic homes throughout Georgetown, as well as just fun stuff about Georgetown and Williamson County's history. So come check that out.
That is really great. I am excited to be able to get back into the Texas History Room. That's one of my favorite resources when I'm doing research and trying to learn more. And we have some really fun records in there. Also some books that you might not have seen about Georgetown's history, local history, and that would be a great resource to check out. Especially during these hot days, the library is air conditioned, so it's a great place to hang out in the afternoon and do a little bit of history reading if you're interested in that. So I don't see that we have any questions, but really glad to have everybody join us today. Thank y'all so much. Remember, we're taking our summer break for August. We'll be back in September with more Tuesday Talks, and we're really looking forward to sharing more about Georgetown's history with y'all. So everybody take care and have a good rest of your week.
Thanks.